Thank you, Kay. Well, we're back in Israel looking at some of the key events of the life of the prophet Elijah. And if you were with us last week, you remember that this is a rocky time in Israel's history. These events take place while King Ahab was on the throne, described as doing great evil in the eyes of the Lord. He's a worshipper of the idol god Baal, believed to be the giver of life and prosperity. Keep Baal happy, make the right sacrifices, perform the right rituals, and he will send rain, make the crops grow, bring fertility, prosperity for his worshippers. And it's a belief that is seeping through Israel at this point as they abandon Yahweh, the one true God, and pin their hopes, it seems, on Baal instead. And it's in direct confrontation to this thinking that God, through Elijah, has declared that there will be drought in the land, no rain at all, until he says so. He's the one who controls the rain, not Baal. But then last week we saw God, even in the midst of the drought, continue to provide for Elijah, first through a brook and ravens, and then by leading him to the house of a widow and her son. And these two were on the brink of starvation, just enough flour and oil left to make one more piece of bread, to have one more meal, then die. But through Elijah, as we heard, God blessed this woman, much to the disgust of the scandalized audience later on. The flour and oil didn't run out that day, or the next day, or in the long days or weeks or months to come until the rains came again. Instead, they kept miraculously being refilled and topped up and refilled. And in some respects, you'd think that would be enough, wouldn't you? Most of us, I think, would like to think that if we were on the receiving end of an ongoing miracle like that, seeing the provision of God in a way which absolutely could not be explained by any other means, that would be enough to fill us with faith in God, to know and trust in his blessing, to be drawn to worship him. And maybe that's how it was with this widow. Maybe she was able to spend some time, even quite a long time, enjoying God's blessing, feeling held by God, knowing that he was watching over her. We're not told. But what we are told is that after some time, whatever had built up, whatever her relationship with God was looking like, it all came crashing down again as her son got ill and died. And notice that he doesn't just drop dead suddenly, unexpectedly. No, he's ill for some time, slowly getting worse and worse before finally stopping breathing. And you can imagine, can't you? The anguish, the desperation, the night spent by his bedside, the tears, the pleading, the begging, the crying out to God to save him. But all to no avail. And then, as he dies, the anger at Elijah and to God as it seems that blessing has turned to curse. What have you got against me? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son? Are you punishing me, God? Why? Why this? Why me? And notice Elijah's response to her. He doesn't give her a prim lecture about the fall or a doctrine of original sin. He doesn't give some glib answer about future eschatological hope and how it's all going to be okay. Those things might have been theologically correct and may be appropriate for a different time, but they wouldn't have been right for that moment. Instead, as we heard read, he takes the boy from her and carries him upstairs and himself falls down weeping and crying out to God, joins her in her anguish. Elijah too, it seems, struggling to understand. And if we're honest, many of us have been in that place, haven't we? Not perhaps from going through something as dramatic and horrific as losing a child, although some of us have faced that. But many of us know what it feels like to go from knowing that we are under the wing of God, his protection, blessing, feeling unassailable. I've come to know God. I have a relationship with him. Life is brilliant. To suddenly having all that crashing down as illness and suffering and pain and death come sweeping into our lives in one form or another. So many of us know what it feels like to pray and plead in tears before God, but to apparently no avail. It's so easy, isn't it, to feel like God must be punishing us as we struggle to understand why he doesn't appear to be listening, as we find ourselves asking why this is happening, why us, why me, why are you allowing this? Many of us have been there in this pandemic, as we struggle to understand why all this is happening, as we've been forced to confront a fragility of life so familiar to, 2/3 of the world's population, but relatively alien to most of us here in the West. As we found ourselves wondering at the apparent injustice of it all, as some appear to show no symptoms while others die and suffer from long-term debilitating illness. It seems so unfair when people who've waited for ages for life-changing operations once again get them postponed or cancelled, when those in the middle of vital treatment programs suddenly have them interrupted. It seems so unfair when we think about the impact on our children or those who are struggling with their mental health. The list goes on. Why, God? Why are you allowing this to happen? Back in the upstairs room, Elijah, as we've heard, cries out to God. But then he does something which seems slightly odd. With the boy's body laid on the bed, Elijah stretches himself over him 3 times, praying as he does so that life would return to his body. Why the stretching? Well, we don't really know. Although it's probably worth saying at this point that it's not something we'd recommend you try if you ever find yourself in a similar situation. Some have suggested that it's a ritual that bears some resemblance to other healing rituals of local customs at the time, a form of contactual magic. That seems unlikely. More probable, I think, is that this was in some way an act of identification, of solidarity. Death was considered by Israel to be an unclean thing. To touch a dead body would make you ceremonially unclean. And so by deliberately laying himself on this body, it seems that here Elijah is entering into identification with the uncleanness of death, entering into full solidarity with the suffering of this boy and his mother. And in doing so, of course, he offers a glimpse, acts as a precursor of the time later on when God himself would come and enter into full identification and solidarity with all our suffering, even to the point of death. When God himself in Jesus would come and be with us, so that in taking our death upon himself, he might conquer it and allow us to share in his resurrection life. Often, if not always, the first and best response to those suffering around us is not words, but instead to allow ourselves to identify, to be in solidarity with them in their suffering and pain, so that through us they might become aware of the presence of God, who is also with them. Elijah prays, as we've heard. And you've got to love the simplicity of the mirroring of the language here. We're told, he cried out to God, Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him. The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. As Elijah carries the boy back downstairs and gives him to his mother and says, look, your son is alive. She responds, no doubt through tears of confusion and joy. Now I know that you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. Suddenly she knows that God was not punishing her, that she was not under his curse. Suddenly she knows once again that God, not Baal, is the Lord of all life. Suddenly she knows once again what it means to receive blessing from the God of all creation. And you're left with the feeling that if we'd been allowed to linger in that room, linger on that scene just a little bit longer, just a few moments more, we'd have seen her begin to respond in the only appropriate way, falling down on her knees in worship of Yahweh, the God of all things. God is the Lord of all life. He is the one who gives and takes away, who sustains, who prospers all of creation. And what that looks like for this widow is a brilliant outcome, her son brought back to life. But we know all too painfully that that's not always the way the story goes. That some of us don't get to see our prayers answered in the way we might want. Some of us are left in our grieving and anguish. Some of us read stories like this one and aren't comforted by it all, but just have our questions reinforced. Why can't you do that for me, for us? Why can't you do what you did for that widow, Lord? And I don't have any easy answers to that. But maybe to say that God is the Lord of all life isn't just to treat him like a bigger, more powerful, better version of Baal. We go through the motions on our end, performing the right rituals, saying the right prayers, and expect him to uphold his end of the bargain and deliver what we want from him. Maybe instead it's to see that there's something more subtle, more complex going on here. Maybe to say that God is the Lord of all life is to recognize that he doesn't cause our pain and suffering. He's not punishing us as the widow first thought. That the presence of death in the world is a direct result of God loving us so much that he was willing for us to choose our own path, even if that meant turning away from life with him. That despite this, he doesn't turn away or abandon us, but instead, as we've said, enters into our world and our lives, taking our pain and our suffering upon himself, dying and conquering death so that we can have the hope of life once again. Maybe to say that God is the Lord of all life really is to learn to entrust everything, life and death and everything in between, into his hands, trusting that somehow through the swirling currents of joys and sorrows and ups and downs, even at those moments which seem hardest, when all seems to be lost, he is working his purposes out. That even death is not the end of the story now, for there is nowhere beyond the reach of God's love and redemption. All things are held in his hands. And I know that it's easier to say those words than to live them. But my prayer this morning is that if you find yourself in the place of the widow today, crying out to God and feeling abandoned by him, I pray that you would know the reassurance of his presence with you in the darkest of places, would know that he is there grieving beside you, would know that whatever is happening here and now is not the whole picture for him. There is hope, there is life, there will one day be resurrection, because death is already conquered. And may those of us who find ourselves in a position like Elijah this morning, maybe we could hear the call to not disengage from those who are struggling and suffering. And instead, may we be able to join them where they are. Join in their anguish, join in their prayers, be the means of God's presence and comfort alongside them. And may we all, whatever we're going through, be able to lift our eyes to God, be able to respond to him in worship. For he is the one who has conquered the grave. He is the Lord of all life. Amen.